Welcome everyone to the DONDENA seminar. I'm very happy to introduce Irene Menendez Gonzalez, who is at EA University in Madrid. We go back a long time because we know each other from our Oxford days some time ago. Irene has made a brilliant career already then, but even afterwards, working in IPE related issues and working on a lot of issues surrounding political economy, welfare states, doing that also in Latin America as well as in Europe, but it's not the only thing that Irene does. She's published in all of the places that we think are important. And I think we were talking a bit yesterday already. This is, I think, a really important next step of the project of the work that Irene is working on. So I'm very happy that she took the time in her busy schedule to visit us. I look forward to hearing the paper. We will try to finish a little bit ahead of time so that we can also grab her for lunch, but it shouldn't take away from the questions that we're going to ask.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. Should I just step over here? Yeah, so this is work. It's relatively new. I'm very grateful for your feedback. Next, this is the work with Sarah Behrens from Innsbruck, Santiago López Carigoni from Uni de la República in Montevideo, and Armin von Schiller from the German Development Institute. It's basically part of a bigger project on the politics of informality and public goods provision. Many of you may wonder what informality actually is. The way we look at it in this project refers to non-compliance with public regulations, and it's a key issue in many developing middle-income and low-income economies. It's associated with a number of evils: low productivity, poverty, weak revenue collection already in weak states, and generally, it's kind of like a big obstacle to welfare, human welfare and development. So, a lot of governments in the last 15 years or so in the global south have implemented formalization programs, which typically help to induce entry into formal status. This might mean inducing people to pay taxes, inducing people to pay public utilities, which is going to be the focus of this project, or formally working the labor market by having a contract with your employer, which gives you access to social protection. But we know significantly less about whether sustaining formal connections actually helps to cope with informality, particularly during crises, which are recurrent in today's globalized world and in many middle and low-income democracies. So we're going to basically argue that for something called deferring compliance, which we argue has the potential to cope with, to sustain through its effect on sustaining connections to cope with informality, it's situated between two well-known concepts in the literature, which many of you perhaps may have come across: enforcement, which implies implementing the law, and forbearance, which means turning a blind eye to violations of the law. Okay, so the big question, I think, that drives this problem is really an ages-old one, which is how can I say resource-constrained, I'm going to say cash-stripped governments ensure compliance with regulations in ways that are economically and politically viable? It's a very old question. It's theoretically and empirically not far from resolved. What typically happens in these economies is that governments lower. So standard enforcement responses are very hard to implement, particularly during crises, where if enforcement levels are maintained, access to basic services and other services might actually be cut among wide segments of the population. So it's politically very tricky. But something else in the form of forbearance, meaning turning a blind eye and essentially tolerating violations of the law, in our case, illegally consuming electricity, I'll go into in a second, is also fiscally quite costly. So the question, we're going to take a slightly different take in this project and basically ask whether and how can governments sustain formal connections. And this is important for a number of reasons. Trivially, it's massively important for public goods provision in the area of public utilities. non-payment, non-compliance in terms of non-payment of public utilities really weakens revenue connection and infrastructure, which is key for obviously to maintain secure access. But beyond that, we now know more than before that shocks have very large and persistent effects on informality, which go beyond their effects on the poor. And so, you know, in the volatile, macroeconomically volatile economies of middle-income countries, which we're going to focus on Uruguay in this paper, such as the Latin American ones, you know, the formal, what we call the formal group, meaning the non-poor on income levels, but low income groups are very much at risk of poverty. They're at risk of transiting to informality if they lose their jobs. So we think it's really quite important to design interventions that, you know, that keep these people on board, that encourage people to remain formal in the event of crisis. Okay, just a little bit about the broader project. Today's talk is really going to focus on the behavioral effects of the policy. And, you know, basically, I'm going to be sort of like putting forth the question of, does deferring compliance, which involves deferring to a future the obligation, any outstanding obligation to pay, does this actually sustain compliance, meaning does it induce compliance at a later date? And I'm going to be showing you data from a policy intervention that was launched in Uruguay in the wake of the pandemic in 2020. I'm going to be showing you some observational analysis to evaluate the effect of the policy, but also some experimental data which allows us to get a little bit about the mechanisms that drive compliance. But there's a second leg of the project which is currently ongoing and which I don't have any data on to show you today, but which kind of gets at the more political economy angle of the project by basically trying to understand. We're actually launching the survey as we speak, trying to understand the structure of support among non-policy beneficiaries. Okay, but we're going to be focusing on today on this. So, does the policy of deferring compliance among non-poor indebted households, I'll go into this in a second, increase compliance with basic services, understood as payment with the electricity bill? So we're going to argue that deferring compliance has a number of attractive features for policymakers. It's economically and politically attractive. And because of this, has the potential to protect against informality. But the twist is that it may lower perceptions of enforcement. I'll go more into that. And so we're going to see whether it works in terms of whether it actually sustains compliance as we think it should be doing. And I'm going to show you evidence from Uruguay during the pandemic in terms of the effect of the policy on compliance. We leverage, again, the introduction of a payment deferral plan by the state-owned electricity company in response to rising informality during the pandemic. But I'm also going to show you the effect of priming the benefits of the formal connection, which is an argument, a micro-level argument I'm going to develop in a second, that in a sense gives us some indication of why we may expect individuals to increase compliance in the context of this policy. Okay, so just briefly by way of theoretical considerations. We start from the premise that whether electorally or whether driven by electoral ideological considerations, governments are going to care about maintaining access to basic services and also about minimizing revenue losses in the short and potential midterm. But they do face a time inconsistency problem, we think, in the form of the following. Even governments with long-term economic incentives to enforce the law may be tempted in the short term to not enforce, to forbear, because the benefits of doing so are going to be greater than the long-term costs. We think this problem is exacerbated during crises because shocks trigger policy cycles that make forbearance very attractive in the following sense. And we're starting to think about this. So let's see how this goes. With the onset of crisis, governments have strong incentives to forbear. If enforcement levels are maintained in the context of crisis, access to basic services such as electricity, water, are going to be cut with enforcement. So they face very strong incentives to forbear, to signal commitment to vulnerable groups, boost access to basic services, and thus signal commitment to vulnerable groups. But maintaining forbearance is fiscally, throughout the crisis, is fiscally tricky. It's very costly. On the other hand, returning to pre-crisis levels of enforcement, right? The assumption is that we're not making claims about there being an absolute level, but pre-crisis levels of enforcement are going to vary by country pre-crisis. Returning to those pre-crisis levels of enforcement is made increasingly difficult over time because debt accumulates. And so it's very difficult to just simply go from a position of forbearance to all of a sudden asking people to pay the whole amount of debt. Governments are going to be tended to offer amnesties. But amnesties have their own set of perils. They renounce revenue, they waive debt, and they also signal that compliance, timely compliance at least, is not important. And so this may have spillover effects even among compliers. Overall, this is going to mean that, you know, in the way towards returning to stricter levels of enforcement, compliance levels post-crisis are probably going to might be lower than those with which they start. So the question is, given this cycle, how can governments navigate? How can we incentivize them to leave, to credibly move away from forbearance, which is very difficult, without incurring the risks of doing so, the fiscal risks of incurring into forbearance? Yes.
So I was just thinking that, like, I mean, it's in the area of Latin America I know less well, but in, like, if you think about Europe during COVID, what it did is it didn't necessarily do forbearance. What it did is it compensated some households on doing that. So is this scoped on weak state capacity?
Absolutely. It's scoped on moderate levels of state capacity.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Good point. I mean, governments are tempted. No, absolutely. I mean, governments will lower enforcement, as we'll see in a second, in response to crisis, particularly in contexts which have low protection. Yeah.
So just to understand the context a little bit better from your angle. So first, what is in these countries typically? How are these services provided? So are these state-owned companies? Is there a private sector that is providing?
No rule of thumb. It varies a lot. It varies a lot. So in Uruguay, electricity is publicly owned. Public utilities company is public. In Turkey, what we see is that very many public utilities companies, publicly owned and private owned, did deferred payment plans.
Then going back to scope conditions, so is this also scoped on not just limited government capacity, but also not sufficient or not sufficiently well functioning financial markets? Because the other thing where in crisis usually you happen in places like the US and Europe, like we let monetary policy solve the issue, right? So we increase liquidity, and that if you have a well functioning financial sector, that if we assume that allocates the excess purchasing power across the board, then that could be a different solution without governments have to change.
It's a great point. I actually hadn't thought about this from this angle. My sense is, of course, that I mean, a lot of these middle-income democracies borrow heavily from international markets, and when crisis strikes, their borrowing capacity is even more limited.
Yeah, also because you get this flight into safe currencies, right?
Yeah. So it's another restraint. It's another restriction. So what does this mean? Basically, there's this crisis. This crisis triggers a cycle. policy cycle, which we think is pretty common, but we haven't documented across all regional contexts. But we're going to argue that deferring compliance is going to allow governments to a little bit more credibly commit to returning to pre-crisis levels of inflation. Why? Basically because on paper, at least, the option of deferring compliance does a better job, I'm going to argue, than most other options on the table, and this is not an exhaustive list. Okay. Why? It maintains, relative to forbearance, it maintains access, which is politically attractive, but it doesn't actually renounce revenue, just postpones it to a future date. It implies sustaining formal connections, it's keeping people on board. It does require communication with users, and this is a feature that we explored in the experimental design to prime them with information about different things. But, you know, ex ante, it might signal lower enforcement to the extent that perhaps households anticipate the cycle. We've gone through many crises before, so they may anticipate the notion that governments may actually stick to forbearance, which is politically difficult to move away from. So we don't actually know whether this works. But you know, it is important to understand the behavioral effects of this policy in order to understand whether the extent to which governments have room to implement the policy. Okay, so then next, when can we think that formal non-poor households might be driven to comply? Here we basically draw from the tax compliance literature and posit that, in a very simple framework, posit that individuals are going to care about pecuniary and non-pecuniary motivations. They derive some utility from income, which is here exogenous, and from something that social norms. We call them normative benefits, but it's basically social norms, which of which we focus on two, which are underexplored in this in the study of utilities. Vertical reciprocity refers to the idea that individuals are going to be driven to comply if they believe that they get more public or quality public goods in return. And horizontal reciprocity refers to the idea that that they will be more likely to comply if they see that those around them do so, because it reduces perceptions of free riding alike. But in addition, we're going to sort of tap into this third source of preferences, which we call the tangible benefits of a formal connection, which is really not something that's been very explored in the literature. But you know, formal connections are more stable. They're more reliable, particularly during bad weather conditions. You know, it's about better quality service, but it's also actually in many of these countries a guarantee of accessing credit, which is not a trivial thing. So you know, you have to go show that you've been paying regularly your electricity bills in order to be eligible for a mortgage. The logic that we should that we're putting out there right now is because paying the bill lowers disposable income for many of these households, they will only be driven to pay when the indebted households are only going to be driven to pay if the benefits of the formal connection are sufficiently high as the normative benefits aim to. So these two things. Now, in other words, if these two things are sufficiently salient, they might be induced to comply. Empirically, we can distinguish the two. But theoretically, we're just positing that they basically go in the same direction because both might be at work. Okay, so this leaves us with a number of empirical implications. One is that we should see an increase in compliance in terms of payment with the electricity bill among policy beneficiaries. And the other is that among policy beneficiaries, those that are reminded about the tangible benefits, as well as other non-pecuniary motivations, should also increase, be more likely to pay the bill. And you know, this has important implications for policy. It might hide some differences, some heterogeneity, which you know, time permitting, I can go into. But even this is in itself quite novel in terms of policy implications. Okay, so just a little bit about Uruguay. We're focusing on a middle-income democracy with relatively high levels of, moderate levels of state capacity, which is important for us because it means that policymakers can choose to not enforce if they wish to. It's also a case which, like all of its regional neighbors, has seen cycles of informality with crisis. And so, you know, two important scope conditions, in addition to the one that Catherine mentions, behind the choice of Uruguay, it's hit by COVID-19 like everyone else in March 2020. The government imposes, shuts down some productive and educational sectors, but doesn't really implement any strict confinement measures. In April 2020, the government mandated a disconnection ban, which means that it mandated that, which de facto lowers enforcement. It means, it de facto meant that it suspended, it mandated that public utilities, electricity and water, do not suspend service due to accumulated debt in the context of the pandemic. By the way, this is not only specific to Latin America, a lot of European countries did this too. In July 2020, the state-owned electricity company UTE implements deferred compliance. It rolls out a program of payment deferral targeted to households that are eligible for service cuts, meaning those that have more than 2 unpaid bills between March 15th and July 30th, 2020. The plan per se is basically refinances debt at 0 interest over 12 months, starting from October, and without applying any additional fines charges. So one feature of the plan that's interesting for us is relates to its take-up. UTE sends out personalized letters to eligible households, telling them about their inclusion in the program, and automatically includes them in the absence of a reply. So this raises, you know, the possibility that households are not perfectly informed about their inclusion in the program, which is something that we're going to take up in the experimental design. Okay, so did deferred payment actually lead to increases in terms of in compliance in terms of paying bill? So not so easy to find a yes.
Sorry, just a quick clarification. So if I understand that the deferral policy meant that there is basically the delayed debt would not accrue any extra interest. So in Latin America, when there is a crisis, usually the first thing that people will expect is inflation. Right? So that basically, if I have a rational expectation, it means that if my debt is deferred, that repayment is deferred, it's actually a reduction in the bill. Right? I mean, maybe it's not as bad as Argentina, right? In the case of Uruguay, but I mean, that would be my expectation if my country goes into crisis in Latin America. There's going to be double-digit inflation very soon.
So then this might increase in terms of comply.
Yeah, so yeah, because I want to get the deferral because it means actually a reduction in real.
Okay, so we compare. So we want to find a good comparison group. Not so easy because actually our sample of indebted households comprises every indebted household in Uruguay as a result of the pandemic during the period March to July. But we can compare households that qualify for service cuts, meaning that are eligible for service cuts for which you need 3 unpaid bills between March 15th and July, so our sample of indebted households, with households that qualify for service cuts just outside the window of policy eligibility. So these are people, these are households who actually otherwise look incredibly similar in terms of relevant payment, I'm going to show you in a second, and other trends, but which accumulated critically, the third unpaid bill just outside the window of policy eligibility. Okay, so basically this, but didn't, and thus did not benefit from the policy. So
when was the policy announced?
The policy was announced in July.
But then for this, like the control group,
Yeah,
they have not anticipated that maybe there will be a future one, so they using the same logic, like they wanted to benefit from the inflation, not they wanted to be talking to this.
So you're saying, might they have, so there had been a disconnection ban, but the policy hasn't yet been announced as yet. So you're saying, might they have?
For the ones in
that,
August 1 and 30,
Yeah.
they saw that the policy was announced before, right?
End of July,
Yes.
right?
And they wanted to benefit from the same policy in the future, so they decided not to pay.
It's possible, but it's possible, but I find it, that would require that people within a few days decide not to comply with payment by one bill. Possible. I don't quite know how to look into this, but I'll put it down. Yeah.
Kind of as a solution to this, why not looking at households that didn't pay maybe one or two instead of two, like the kind of discontinuity that is given by the two unpaid bills compared to one only. So those would also be in the pre-announcement period.
Yeah.
And also, I guess, in expectation similar because it's just one bill more. I mean, sometimes I also forget to pay bills.
Okay, so compare households that have,
And then, I guess
defaulted only once. So to
yeah,
speak.
because you have this discontinuity with it, even though it's discrete. I mean, you have more than two, right? Unpaid bills. So there are plenty that had just one who couldn't access the program.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess that's also interesting.
Okay.
In some ways, I mean, the thing, Anna, what you were saying, it does require them to have enough options to be able to sort when they pay or don't pay. I mean, I don't know what the characteristics of these people are, but no, or am I thinking about that the wrong way?
I mean, the thing is, like this group have already missed one bill, right? So we know they're probably not the richest, or maybe
No, they're not the richest.
Not the richest people. So it is valid in this sense, but yeah, I know. If they, I don't know, maybe if a lot of them are supposed to pay by second half of August, they would have enough time to sort into this. They actually have to decide by August 1st or 2nd. That's I don't know the context.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Oh. Okay, so defining control and treated groups by policy eligibility, we basically have 1,300 plus households that accumulated debt at around the same time, but didn't benefit from the policy, and that are otherwise very similar. I'll show you on the next slide. It allows us to estimate the effective policy in ways that are very similar to the different if. We exploit the parallel trends assumption, but we're going to use a slightly different model, which my co-author finds very fancy. But our results are too bold for a classic. There is no staggered adoption. Okay, so it's quite clean and neat in that sense. Okay, so these graphs, I'm very sorry, I should have seen this before this, but I didn't. But basically plot mean values of compliance, pay yes, pay no pay, with a given month on the left, and monthly amount on the right, among treated in red, if you can see that, and control, non-beneficiaries. And let's see if I can, okay, so the trends are really, we have about 12 months of pre-treatment trends. The trends are very similar. The levels are also very similar between the two. A bare majority basically pays pre-pandemic across both groups. And then basically sometime in March, payment behavior starts to differ across the two. And then in August 2020, shortly after the policy is announced, payment behavior differs slightly between the two. Pretty much the same with monthly payment. August payment behavior, payment amount differs between these two groups. I mean, I've hardly ever seen trends that track each other so closely. So I was happy about this.
This is convincing. Can you explain the outcome, though? I'm not.
Yeah, sorry. So the outcome here is monthly. This is the amount in pesos, and this is whether they pay with the bill, yes or no, in a given month.
But isn't the bill deferred?
From the policy starts is announced in July and starts in August. So they start not to pay between March, basically between this period here. March, August, there's a drop in payment among both groups. They start to accumulate debt, they're not paying. But then the policy kicks in August. And the treated ones start to pay. Yeah.
Sorry, so, I'm constantly worried about expectations here. So mentioned already the expectation of inflation, but now I'm thinking that if I'm someone who went through this crisis several times, then I can expect actually that deferred payment to be not the best outcome. Because it might happen that my payment is deferred because of inflation, I will have to pay less. But the other group might expect that there will be a complete amnesty as well. So if I don't get into this scheme and I continue not to pay, at some point it's not a problem because the government is going to issue it.
Yeah. I can show you how the treatments in the experiment affect perception about enforcement. Yeah, it's a problem. We have some data, but hopefully it addresses some of that. Okay, so the regression basically quantifies this trend, this effect. The dependent variable here is whether households pay in a given month. And the effect is quite large. I mean, it's basically a 40 percentage point increase between July and January 2021, which is when we have the last point for which we have data. Yeah, it's remarkable. Also, I think because the policy was announced under this sort of like positive silence figure, so many could have not really known about it. Anyway, so this is a result, a first result based on quantifying the effect of exposure to the policy. What we do next is we prime. I'm going to show you some experimental evidence that primes individuals with a number of things in order to understand what is driving this effect. Okay, so again, positive for that is recall. This is what we're going to exploit in the experimental design. People may just simply not be perfectly informed. They were informed about their inclusion in the policy through a personalized letter in July. Some may have been informed about it. Others may have simply just thrown the letter into the bin. So we estimate the effect of a policy reminder that makes salient the benefits of formal connections, plus other non-pecuniary messages that relate to non-pecuniary motivations, both horizontal and vertical. And we paired up with the public utilities companies who did to send out information letters in December 2020. Okay, so basics. We have 2 control conditions and 4 information letters. The baseline treatment, I would say, weakly primes the benefits of formal connections. I'll show you the letter in a second, because it basically makes the costs of disconnection apparent. It's a bit of a symmetrical. To this baseline treatment, we're going to add information that triggers beliefs about vertical reciprocity, so making salient that good quality connections depend on everyone paying, and about horizontal reciprocity, where we make apparent that pretty much every household that was in a similar situation paid. The reason we do this is that they was unwilling to publish actual figures, so we just kept it like that. And combining both vertical and horizontal, which is of no relevance whatsoever, I can anticipate right now, but I can show you it's a very, the letters look very similar, the combined ones. This leaves us with about 16,000 plus households in Uruguay. And again, these are like recently indebted households that accumulated more than 2 unpaid bills between March and July. Did not exclude those that benefit from any sort of like subsidized tariff. And we assign treatment based on these covariates here: household debt in July, whether the household was eligible for service cuts, and the level of theft losses in user substations, for which we have data on, across 81 areas, 63 neighborhoods in Montevideo, which concentrates more than half the population, and 18 departamentos or districts. These are administrative districts in the rest of the country. Okay, this is the timing. In July, UTE informs households of their inclusion in the program through the personalized letter. From August onwards, bills are sent out, just normally. So those who get the bills, if they accumulate more than 2 unpaid bills, they again are eligible for service cuts. And then in October, the first bill, including the first of the 12 installments, is sent out. And our treatments go out shortly before Christmas to all policy beneficiaries, regardless of whether they actually paid or not, but those that were included in the policy in July. Okay, so Spanish, bear with me. This is a treatment that says 2 things. One is, did you know that UTE cushioned the impact of the crisis with special measures? Paragraph 2 says, in order to avoid service cuts, UTE designed a refinancing plan which does not apply any fines or surcharges, financing over 12 monthly installments with no additional, with no interest. That's the policy plan. And then to this, we add a message about horizontal reciprocity where we say, most under your situation, naturally uptake was close to 100%, ended up taking up the program. And then treatment 3 says, quality is dependent on your paying. Quality of the service is dependent on paying, which is the lower part. Okay, so
again, who's the sender of this?
this is a public utilities company.
Okay, so you partner.
We partner together with a public utilities company.
Yeah, sorry, just.
No. So, you know, which is the reason why we put the sample of indebted households. Yeah.
So, I mean, it goes back to the level of being informed or the extent to which you think they are informed. So what do we know about the human capital of these consumers? Because this is quite, you know, specific information, I would imagine, with some terminology. So to what extent we can think of, the new PISA tests in Europe say that 25% of 14-year-olds are functionally illiterate, and that's the EU. So.
Yeah. We have, I don't think we have data on skill level.
I mean, you can, one way to think about is just,
Yeah.
it's one form of not being informed.
But it's not low in Uruguay, in Latin America.
So this is formal. These are people who, I mean, I think of these people as people who up until the crisis were paid. So, and they wish to pay on average. They
So
wish
it's
to
more
keep.
middle class.
It's the middle
not the
class.
educated, yeah.
In many countries, you know, in the Latin American context, the median order is in some is barely informed. So in some countries, informality reaches, you know, is 60%, but in others, it's less. So, you know, these are people who are typically who have been formally paying their bills. We have income by data. The data by income. We know that there's quite a lot of variation in terms of income, but still, it's the middle class. But we don't. I don't know that we can get data on skill. Okay, so we define our outcome variable using a binary measure of payment with the fee in January 2020. And we're going to compare. Oh, I forgot to tell you about the placebo. Sorry. The placebo letter is simply a letter that informs people about the energy saving capacity of some plants. And I'm going to show you estimates across the full sample first. And in order to sort of like explore some measure of plausibility of our mechanism, I'm going to show you what the treatments do among a group of personal impacts. And if there's time, I can show you, I'm going to show you actually data on perception and enforcement. Okay, so across the full sample, the policy reminder across the board, Model 1 shows unadjusted effects, Model 2 includes the covariates, and Model 3 includes the geographical unit dummies. Increases payment in January by about 1.7 percentage points. 170 out of 10,000 people pay in response to that. Is not significant. But when combined with the horizontal and the vertical reciprocity measure, it becomes significant, and the size of the effect is very similar. So my reading of this is that it's actually much of what's driving the effect in the combined letters is being driven by the policy reminder. Which means that, letters that combine messages, non-pecuniary motivations with information about the benefits of formality appear to work. Okay, so the effect is also stronger for households with a history of non-compliance. Why do we include this? Why do we care about this? Beyond the massive policy implications that this might have. We kind of like start from the assumption that, well, we think the average effects are capturing the value that our sample of households attach to remaining formal. That's kind of the mechanism, right? But Uruguay, the Uruguayan government implemented this connection ban, goes back to expectations, and then implemented the deferral payment program. So it's entirely plausible that some portion of households lowered perceptions of enforcement in response to the disconnection ban, and then sort of like update perceptions again with the policy. Okay, so this is what we find. So we code here those with a past episode of theft, irregular collection. Sorry, I keep saying theft, but it's an irregular collection in the past. And the effect sizes are pretty large. It leads to an increase of about 11 percentage points, which is a 30% increase.
And is that, so that's Ute knowing that there has been an irregular, exactly, so it's no self-reporting.
No.
Okay.
This
Yeah.
is based on the administrative
Yeah.
records of Ute,
Okay.
which, and we spoke to a technician about this from Ute, and they told us that.
Okay.
Oh,
We also. No, you.
and
Exactly.
that those who incurred in episodes of irregularity are highly likely to do so again. Okay, so it's not about property. Okay, so the horizontal reciprocity treatment factorized within the baseline also has this also lead that again these households kind of believe that most like them are not paying, and then are reminded of, with a policy reminder, and that's one reading of it. Okay, anyway, so this lends some plausibility. This means that, essentially, people are reacting to the policy reminder in ways that are consistent with what we think should be happening. Okay, what am I doing for time? I'm going to show you perceptions. Okay, so this is this here shows estimates of the effect of treatment on perceptions of compliance. Focus first on the first two columns, forget the rest. On our sample of formal households. No cuts, column 1 and no cuts is a binary outcome variable that defines households according to whether they believe they will cut in the absence of payment. Do you think they will cut you off if you don't pay? There is no effect of the policy reminder on perceptions of enforcement, so defined. This is telling us that actually, that these people are no different in terms of how they anticipate the effects of the policy from those in the control group. Which is also, we start from the premise that people understand the consequences of the policy, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't, what reason would they have to comply? If they know that they're gonna not be disconnected, then there's no point in complying. But this is sort of like initial evidence showing that the treated people are not massively different. The people in the placebo, a majority thinks actually that they will be disconnected. They don't pay. Now, this is, how am I doing for time? Are we good?
Oh, you go.
Okay, good. So this is a slightly bizarre, I'm not too convinced about this, because I don't know what 3 months means in people's minds, but this taps into perceptions of enforcement understood as how long do you think you can keep on accessing electricity before Putin cuts you off? Again, doesn't seem that there's differences between treated and non-treated, even though it seems here the majority believes that they can keep on paying if they keep on consuming in the absence of payment. But I don't know what time frame people have in mind when they believe that what's the most plausible time frame before people think, oh, I will be cut.
If you ask me this year, I would say yes, I can still use it in 3 months. I mean, I don't know what you guys think. So, like, you know what I mean? No, I mean, my experience with electricity companies in many countries, I think, it takes some time.
It takes some time.
It's actually short after these steps.
Sorry, so just that I understand, this basically suggests that the majority believes that there is no amnesty at the end. But
Right, no
but
sanction. Amnesty is a different policy, but no sanction in response to
okay.
no
amnesty,
amnesty. So by amnesty, I mean a
Yes.
whole one policy that says no one pays anymore, but prepare for the
For me, it's a little bit difficult to get my head around this of why people think that they're quite convinced. I mean, these are very highly significant results, right there. So the majority thinks that they will be cut at some point, but then on the other hand, they believe that they can go on for months and months and months.
I mean, this is showing us. So this is saying, look, we won't be let off the well. For me, the more meaningful sort of like interpretation of this result is both groups anticipate the same consequences from the policy. Meaning the treated group does not feel that they're getting off the hook, that they're being let off the hook just because payment is being deferred to the future. To me, this is the more sort of like relevant interpretation, because I mean, the context is very uncertain. I mean, when we actually, when we implemented the experiment, the pandemic was still kind of ravaging. So I agree that expectations are the key. I think all of this hinges on how credible do you think the government's promise of actually sanctioning you if you don't pay is.
Well, and also, I mean, how do we really think if you ask, I mean, I haven't done this, but if you ask and put a survey up across countries about their level of efficiency expectations about a public utility, I think a lot of people think that it would take a long time, that they can use for some moments in time. I really, and I think the evidence, the evidence, at least on some countries, is that actually is the case. I think the interesting thing is in what ways, if it's all this anticipation of the policy, I'm going to get this, that doesn't seem to be going on. People have some basic expectations about what UFTA is going to do, and then if you've gotten a letter, yes or no, that doesn't matter in that way, right? I mean, that's the way to, which leads to some of the things about our people anticipating other stuff that's going to happen. That doesn't seem to be going on.
Sorry, but so for me, still the difficulty in this is, to put it another way, is what actually convinces people to comply and get into this deferral, because the very high coefficient on the constants of placebo on the second model actually says it's going to be deferred anyway by the company, effectively.
Oh, but only deferred over a couple
But
of months.
I agree. I think I just don't know what the relevant cutoff is. So I'm not convinced. Honestly, I'm not convinced. I should think about, how to frame this, because it might be that you know, people think, oh, 3 months is, I don't know, is not much.
Well, and also, what is the actual legal framework for them to be able to do it? Like, I think, for example, in Menendez, I think it is 6 months. Like, it is quite, because it's a basic service.
Yeah.
It's really like, you have to go a high hurdle there for
It's 6 months.
In the Netherlands, it's 6 months, I know, but like, I don't know if it's in, I don't know. If it's in-
Well, here, I mean, here you get cut after 3 unpaid bills, but they don't have to be consecutive.
But can
They
you ask
do
the
not have to be
company,
consecutive, yeah.
can you ask the company, like, was the de facto, like?
Yeah, exactly.
How long does it actually usually?
I don't know why.
Maybe they're just being very good, like they know this stuff, right? Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we know, again, yeah, I'll ask, de facto, people get cut off once they stop paying the third bill, not a consecutive bill. So, you know, you don't have to have 3 consecutive.
But in terms of
unpaid bills.
enforcement, this actually happens.
Oh, in terms of when they get cut
Yeah,
off after
that's
they
right.
paid.
Yeah, and how long it does, like the guy, whatever, I don't know how it works, but this guy going there, cutting off the electricity.
Yeah, so I mean, we know, so I mean, there's also some, you know, it's also kind of interesting, but again, it's premised on this sort of like window of 3 months versus others, which I'm not sure is the relevant one. There's some variation by income here. So we actually, what we see here is that these are among the high income group, higher income, and again, these are not rich people, okay? The treatment, the policy reminder decreases perceptions of enforcement.
Can I ask one thing? So one thing to what Tamás was saying. So this amnesty stuff is not coming from the electricity, it's coming from the government. Did you ask anything about expectations about what the government would do? This is enforcement of the public utility, right? It's a different thing from what you think public policy, you're anticipating about something that's gonna happen, like a debt relief program or something.
No, this is what we're doing next.
Yeah.
So we have,
Would be interesting.
we just haven't been able to, so our next, I mean, part of what we think is interesting is understanding processes of political accountability.
Yeah.
Because it might be that people hold, I mean, in this case, the expectation is that since, and you know, the control, political control of UTE is very strong. So it's, you know, the board of the UTE has political representation in it, and you know, like, and big decisions are political. So obviously in people's minds, you know, this is going to reflect, this is going to say something about the performance of the government.
And there's only one public utility.
And no, but electricity, yes.
Yes.
Yes. And then there's water, they're all public.
Yeah, no, I'm happy.
Yeah, just one. No, absolutely. I think this is super, this is the next step. Yeah. Okay, okay, I think, let me just conclude. So I think this is the first causal evidence that we have on the effects of deferring compliance. I think this is a much more general concept. We focus on public utilities, but many governments, the UK, Spain as well, also deferred mortgage payments under crisis. So potentially, I think this applies, you know, well beyond the sphere of public utilities. I think that the focus on formal, so non-formal households is also quite, like, it gives us a lot of traction in terms of understanding future political economy questions, because this is also a really quite influential group in these countries. So these are typically, you know, formal households are also typically those that are highly unionized. And so, you know, one can think that, again, this might have implications not just for, you know, patterns of accountability, but also for broader aspects of, you know, political economic outcomes. Anyway, so we find that priming the benefits together with non-pecuniary motivations actually matters in terms of shaping compliance. And what we plan to do next is precisely look at the effects on political attitudes and, you know, hopefully be able to extract something meaningful among the non-beneficiaries of the policy who, you know, about whom we know very little. So this might also be relevant because in much, you know, in many of these countries, debates about informality in general are sort of like framed in terms of like, oh, we're helping the poor. But only if they don't get off the hook. Only if they pay, they can, so let's redistribute by providing cash transfers, but let's make them conditional. Anyway, so I think this is now what I have to say, but thank you very much. Are there any questions that?
Comments on the conclusion. The first one, it seems to me that this is very specific. In the sense that in this individual cost benefit analysis, it's clear that the benefit of paying, because of not the cost of the paying, because I think that probably you should be careful in generalizing, because if I don't pay business taxes, then I close the business, I still keep it going. And the other comment is on the treatment of on norms, both vertical and horizontal. Is it possible that people interpret this as a message, how to say, look, we are giving something to you, and this something is costly. So it's not that I'm interpreting as social norm, and this links to Tamas' question, but links to the fact that the company is generous with me, and I appreciate this. So it's another way of modifying the cost-benefit economic calculus without referring to social norms.
Yeah, so we started up with this. We kind of, absolutely, I think we partly started talking about an empathy channel, where the electricity company or the public utilities company said, look, we're going to help you out because, we're going to cushion the effect of the crisis. But it was, I mean, some of this might be going on. It's just empirically, it's hard to sort of like disentangle because we have a bundled treatment. And so, it's not, it could be, we just have no further way of disentangling it. Yeah. So I just quickly respond to the first, absolutely right with not generalizing. I mean, it's in fact, in this respect, I think what's a bit particular about the electricity sector is that, I mean, and this setup is that actually information is known. Information about who is not complying is known to everyone. Because they have the data. You can know who's not. So actually, what's at work here is not even, is the threat of disconnection, which is a penalty, but it's not the likelihood of audit as in tax compliance laws, because they know who's paying. Yeah.
So one quick comment is that, I was interested from the beginning, from the very first slides, to what extent these type of benefits in the Latin American context might actually be inequality enhancing rather than reducing, because you're not really helping the poor, you mostly help the lower middle class, and there is massive inequality at the bottom of the distribution in Latin America as well, right? So, but the other thing what would be interesting for the empirical exercise is also to see to what extent it matters for consumers what they know about other consumers, right? And this could be checked. For instance, one way to check this, because we know exactly where these people are, is to control for density. So to see what happens within Montevideo and outside, right? So whether people who live together with a lot of other households would all be customers of UTEF, and they would talk to each other, whether that actually, because especially when it comes to perceptions, I mean, it actually matters to me if I think that really everyone is going to comply, because all my block is complying, right? Whenever I'm outside in the rural areas, I have no idea what the people are doing.
So yeah, we have data. We have data on this. We have data on actually postal code. It makes sense. Yeah.
Of course, it might be a little bit large of other things as well, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you again, Irene.